let's pretend we're speaking to my mum, 65 years old, and I'm sure she would say to me, I want to lose a few kilograms. Now, it sounds like hyperpalatable foods are somewhat ubiquitous. So how, at an individual level, do we make sense of this? Because it seems extremely complex to be turning around labels and working out percentage fat and sodium and all of these different calculations that perhaps would be too much for the typical person.
I have two pieces of advice. The first would be go for the whole foods, the whole fresh foods that occur as they are in nature. So like the vegetables, the fruit, the whole pieces of meat, the legumes, and buy them in a version that is not really manipulated or dressed up or lots of things added to it. So that way you can have control over that and you can add things as you wish at home, but that's under your control. And you're starting from a whole kind of fresh food as your base. And then the second is watch and be leery of the sodium, because as we know, the two of the three types of hyperpalatable foods contain elevated sodium.
So that's the sneaky one, kind of. I have to imagine, the obvious foods that people think about is ice cream and sugar sweetened beverages. But is it this kind of gray area where you have high sodium foods where these hyperpalatable foods could be kind of sliding under the radar? People aren't aware of them.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And things that might seem relatively benign, like crackers or, pretzels or things like that are pretty common snack foods and things that we might otherwise not view as particularly, concerning. Most of them are hyperpalatable. And it is, it's the sodium, right, is the commonality. So one way I've noticed recently in at least our grocery store that, I don't remember the brand, but there are starting to be some types of crackers that are produced with like no added sodium, or they are described as like a hint of salt or something like that, but they have much lower sodium than the kind of standard comparator like version that the companies produce. And so like that's actually a way that one could, potentially try to find like a cracker that they can snack on, but that, isn't designed to make them eat the whole box.
I think that certainly when I look at something and it says low sodium, my brain says it's not going to taste as good.
That is correct.
I think we've made it clear that in some ways our kind of reward systems have been hijacked by these foods. So are we asking people to a degree to give up some of their joy for food and meals?
Oh, this is an excellent question. Okay. I think, and again, I can speak mostly for the US food environment because that's where most of my work has been done. I think that because our food supply is so saturated with these foods, we have gotten used to kind of experiencing a heightened or exaggerated degree of like reward and pleasure when we consume various types of foods that really, in some sense, shouldn't be there in the same way if we were only consuming like whole and fresh foods. That being said, I think there's a really important distinction between having this kind of artificially rewarding experience and eating whole and fresh foods that in and of themselves are pleasant to consume, right? And so I think that, and this part of my kind of response to this comes because I've had a very distinct comparator environment that I've been able to go into on a regular basis. So this would be Italy. And so there, for example, there are far fewer hyperpalatable foods. And a lot of the foods that are served, or that people cook at home, they are so good. They're fresh. They're like rich with the flavors. Like, and it's wonderful to eat foods there. But most of them are not hyperpalatable. Yes. So I think that that's a really important distinction, that like, we should be enjoying foods that we're consuming. And it can be very reinforcing to do so. But that, I think, is a very different experience than what we're used to currently.
And I feel like some of that is to do with a different way of living, different way of life, how much time we spend cooking. And I have to imagine that a lot of these convenience foods were sort of born out of necessity, dual income homes, less time for, women are not in the kitchen as traditionally they would have been. Cool. So how do we kind of, I guess, square that, people having the time and education and skills to prepare these meals in a way that is still enjoyable? Is that a barrier here?
I think to some degree, but I think also what we've seen in the US in particular is like really an erosion of kind of the degree to which we value food, kind of preparing and cooking and making food. And I actually think that's like from some of my research, what I saw was that the tobacco companies that owned Kraft and they own Nabisco and all these major brands, frozen foods, frozen entrees, convenience meals were a major cornerstone of their focus and the types of products that they developed. And so I think that in a way that may not be present to such a heightened degree like in other countries, we saw that they really leaned into that here. And as a result, I think that, now we're kind of at a point where there is not as much valuation kind of culturally and in society on preparing and cooking foods. But I think that there's a very specific reason that it seems like there is that degree of erosion.